Hi, and welcome to the Brohoyo podcast, the podcast about gacha in general and Hoyoverse games in specific. I'm your host, Steven, and this is my co host, David.
Hey, everyone.
So, in preparation for Natlan, this week we're going to review the 5 regions of Genshin, starting with Mondstadt. For those of you out there who don't play Genshin or maybe have forgotten Mondstadt for whatever reason, it's a vaguely German bohemian styled zone. It's very focused on like the Alps in style. Very the song of music. So with that said, I'm gonna pass it off to Dave. What were some initial thoughts, or what's your overall thoughts of Mondstadt as a region?
So for our time in Mondstadt, this is going to be the player's first zone that they're introduced to when they get into the game. And so I think for me, and maybe a lot of other players out there, being that first zone, I think that the scope and the size of the game kind of really becomes apparent to you very quickly. This is a large game. It's a large zone, and of course, it's only grown larger, which we can dive into what some of the other regions look like. But to me, the zone was pretty big for like the introductory to the game. There was, exploring was new. There was a lot to do, and I think it does a good job being that first zone. And what I mean by that, in terms of tutorial-esque, not holding my hand through it all like a lot of gacha games are kind of notoriously known for, but in terms of things being relatively simple puzzles, having the different statues that react to different elements, and you had to hit them with those corresponding elements, maybe in a certain order or maybe within a certain time frame. So relatively simple puzzles that anybody who's played any type of puzzle adventure game would be familiar with. And then as the game has progressed, we've seen them add layers to those puzzles, and we'll talk about that as we get into those zones. But also in terms of the ease in which you could traverse it. Like you mentioned, it's a lot of Sound of Music, open fields, grassland, a couple mountains here and there to climb and traverse in that regards. Overall, it was, I think, designed to be open and easy to explore, because this is that first zone that we want to capture the player and get them engrossed in the game and have fun exploring, and really make an emphasis on that point. And then I think they did a good job in that with Mondstadt, and then getting us into Mondstadt and the hustle and bustle of the town or the city, and it being unique. And I do want to say this too, is that every zone, I think they do a great job being unique and distinct from the other ones. There's not anything that really feels similar. And I know you'll kind of give a brief overview of each zone as we hit it, but I did just want to say I think they do a good job with that here. But what about you, Steve? What were some of your opening thoughts with Mondstadt being that introductory zone that the players see?
I would agree that except for maybe one very specific area in Mondstadt, Dragonspine, it's a very welcoming zone. It's very open. There are a couple areas that, over the course of the story, you kind of, it gets a little bit more imposing. I'm thinking specifically the wolf area, where the wolf monthly or weekly boss is, and the area blocked off by the wind, the ruins of old Mondstadt. Those two
Talking
zones.
about near in Bright Crown Mountains. You're talking about up where the
Yes.
Dvalin is?
Yeah, where
The other
Dvalin
weekly
is.
boss? Okay, yeah.
Those two areas are a little bit different in tone, but for the most part, it's very green, rolling hills. It feels very welcoming, very open. I think it's not necessarily the best zone for interesting traversal. It's very straightforward for the most part. I also think it's the reason why, looking at it, you get a very Breath of the Wild impression from the game, that as time has gone on, that's changed. They've moved in very different direction with the way that they've designed their zones and so forth. But as an opening zone, there's a lot of similarities to the tutorial area of Breath of the Wild and Mondstadt. Like, I think they fill very, very similar roles. There's a lot of, I don't want to say one-to-ones, but I think you could very easily kind of draw one-to-one parallels between the two, which opens up that comparison, even though I don't think that that's necessarily the intent that the game, that Hoy had with Mondstadt. It also does have its own sort of cultural flair. As I mentioned, it feels like Bohemian Germany, the Bohemia region, and it grabs a lot from that culture. And that's something that we're going to see going forward, is that there's a lot of culture with each region. That typically you can kind of draw one-to-one parallels between it and the real world, but it's definitely different. It's not something that I've necessarily seen as much in video games. Is that
and you did say, a lot of comparisons to Breath of the Wild, and they may not been Hoyoverse's intent, but I know a lot of people did, because that was the big thing when the game launched, was, oh goodness, it's a Breath of the Wild clone type thing. But I agree they've kind of shied away from it a little bit in terms of where they've gone some other zones direction. Now, you did mention Dragonspine,
Yeah.
and I think we can dive into Dragonspine, but it is worth noting that wasn't available on release when the game first came out. That was kind of the next little region or area that was introduced. So we can dive into some of the mechanics that we liked or really hated in Dragonspine, but just for those that maybe didn't come into the game at or near the beginning, or maybe don't play it, this was a smaller region that was introduced in a following patch, so it wasn't available on launch. So they didn't throw us into it. Though I will say, as a player who went in blind, and this zone did exist when I started playing, going from your little hilly churls that are your level to all of a sudden level 40 things that are 30 plus levels above you was a little bit jarring, and I wasn't ready for that. But quickly learned I need to stay on at least the green stuff and stay out of that snow-covered area before I'm ready.
Yeah, and I guess just as a real quick note going forward, we might or might not touch on different subzones as we talk about the regions as they come up and as they're relevant. I do think personally that Mondstadt without Dragonspine isn't Mondstadt. Like, I think the duality of the two work well together, where you have those sort of green, welcoming pastures, and then you have Dragonspine, which is there to take you out back and beat you with a hose and make you regret ever touching that mountain. They have the frost effect. It has there's a lot that goes on with Dragonspine that makes it very unwelcoming, inhospitable, which I think is an interesting contrast with Mondstadt in general, where typically it's the easiest and best you're going to get as far as traversal goes. So that sort of tension.
With that Dragonspine, that frost mechanic. So the frost mechanic on the mountain was basically, if you are not near a heat source, which was pyres on the ground, or you would occasionally have little fireflies that you could follow. You build up chill or cold until eventually that maxes out, and then you start losing damage over time to your character's health bar. It was a pretty annoying mechanic, especially when you had to go do side quests or sub quests kind of out and about.
And also when your only character is Amber, before you get anybody else or pull anybody else.
and too, at the beginning of the game, when the roster is smaller, you don't have very many pyro options or a wealth of a character catalog like we do now. But it did make exploring the mountain itself a little bit more difficult, especially when you were out there looking for the bloodstones, or just random treasure chests or whatever have you, or following the little fairy fires back to their statues type stuff.
Yeah, and I guess as a last sort of mechanical talk about Dragonspire, it was also the first that really kind of introduced the regional collect this and level up and get something mechanic that's going to be coming back in a lot of the other regions. Outside of the
Statues of the Seven.
Yeah, the Statues of the Seven, the homunculuses, or the different
Dendroculuses, or the Geoculuses.
I think it's just oculuses is what they're referred to as. Yeah, other than the oculuses.
Oculuses? Oculi. I don't, whatever. Anyway,
Look, we're
I
not
don't know.
having to actually speak Latin. We
I don't,
can
I don't, I don't, I
pluralize
don't
it
know what the
however we
rules
like.
are on made up words
Yeah.
for pluralities.
Regardless, do you, I guess just to kind of move along, uh, and Mondstadt is the first zone, so some of our other stuff that we'll talk about in future zones it doesn't really quite apply. But from a story point of view, what were your kind of thoughts on the story of Mondstadt?
So yeah, the story, was a good introductory chapter, right? It's setting the stage, setting kind of the tone for what we can expect. So this was a good thing and a bad thing in other regards. So it's a bad thing in that okay, Paimon's just going to repeat everything after it was already said. Like okay, this is what it's going to be. This is what it's gonna be. But in terms of like setting the tone overall, though, it's a good thing. Introduces us to a lot of characters, unique personalities. So we get to meet the Mondstadt Archon, that god of freedom, Venti, right? The drunken bard. Um, and then we meet, the other cast of characters. You meet Jean, the head of the Favonius Knights. You meet Diluc and his story with the city and everything like that. Um, so I think, like I said, it did a good job setting the table. And then if it captured you, in those first story bits, then I think you would want to see the story through to the end. And I think if you come in with an open mind, I think they do that. Because the story for me is something I'm interested to see through to the end, and it starts with that grab in Mondstadt.
Yeah, I'd agree. I would say that I I think my only real criticism of the story is I don't feel that it does a great job of setting up the central conflicts of the later zones. And when I say that, it's mainly that the primary conflict in Mondstadt is very heavily built around the Abyss Mages and that subsection of the story, and I feel like that drops off for 3 or 4 regions after this, and primarily refocuses on Snezhnaya as the main bad guys of the story, and then it re-swerves in another direction as time goes on, but it kind of hypes up the Abyss side of the story a little bit more than what we've gotten. And I feel like Snezhnaya and the conflicts with the Fatui and so on and so forth tend to play a larger overarching. It's more important overall to the next few regions than what you might be necessarily led to believe. Because other than, R.I.P. The Crimson Witch, kicking Venti in the Down Under, there's not really a lot that you're left kind of going like, okay, well, they kicked Venti and stole his Gnosis.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have the climax of the story in the prologue. Like that's
True, but you do
to be
need
fair
to
to
set.
Mondstadt.
That's not really what you need to frame it though, and I think that's where my problem is
Gotcha.
that the framing of it makes it seem like the Abyss is going to be a more consistent, larger scale enemy that
Mhm.
typically, at least in future zones, only really shows up in the post story aspect of a region. Like the main conflict of a region tends to be local to that region, with the Fatui sticking their fingers in it and making a mess, and encouraging problems. And again, it's not end of the world. We haven't seen the end of the story, so my gut tells me that we're going to loop back around, and the Abyss is going to become much more important as time goes on, and that's going to take over a more and more central role in the story, especially post Snezhnaya. But until then, Snezhnaya is sort of our book one baddies, as it were, that we still haven't beat.
Very loose air quotes around baddies because I think we both have some theories on
Yeah.
what we think will happen, but
Uh,
we'll save
um,
that from our Snezhnaya review
Antagonists. They are our antagonists. There we go.
for the time being.
For the time being. Um, and in Child's case, not even that long. But so yeah, I guess
So
would there be anything else that you want to talk about for
no,
Mondstadt?
I was gonna say so. Speaking of Child, moving into our next major region, right where he is a weekly boss,
Mm-hmm.
would be Liwa, with our Geo element focus and Rex Lapis, aka Zhang Li, being the Liwa Archon, the god of contracts. And Steve, why don't you give us a brief introduction on Liwa?
Yeah. Liwa is Tevat China. It's, very obviously the Chinese expat of Teyvat. Just to clarify, Teyvat is the name of the world of Genshin. It's very heavily based in Chinese culture. It's the reason why every New Year's you end up going to Liyue Harbor, which is the main central city, in order to celebrate Chinese New Year,
They have
the
their
Lantern
lunar,
Festival.
yeah, New Year, everything. Yep.
Yep. So it's in many ways the central region of the story. I can't prove it, but I'm willing to bet that the majority of characters come from Liwa, and I only say that because even though we are post Liwa, um, we still have characters that are being released for Liwa. So, that's not something that we see in a lot of other zones. Typically, post that region, you don't go back and have many more characters from that region. Maybe a 4-star here or there, but that tends to be the limit of it. It is, as Dave mentioned, a geo region. It also has a lot of different biomes in it. There is a more mountainous region of large mesas in it. More, I guess, Chinese style mountains. It sounds weird to say, but they're sort of those flat topped, large mesa style mountains instead of the more Appalachian or Rocky Mountain style mountain. For those of you from America, it has beach, it has a swamp for some reason.
Our geology listeners are having a blast with all this mountain talk. But yeah,
Look, I'm not a geologist. I'm not. Can't do it, unfortunately.
it's called this. This is what it's called.
Look, if you know what it is, put it in the comments. I would love to know
We'll
what the
learn.
actual term
The
is
more you
for
know,
them.
we'll
But
learn something.
yeah, don't know that. It's also important to mention that this is where the Adepti are from, where there's actually demigod characters that are the Adepti that run around, because they're a major portion of the story. But that's a sort of a rambling, probably not great description of the area. So I guess I'll jump right into, yeah, Dave. What were your thoughts on the zone, or what were your memories or feelings?
Yes. So my memories of Liyue, I really enjoy the zone. Like you said, it does have a lot of different kind of biomes. You have like you mentioned, the Adeptus kind of have their region, which is, to the local citizens, very kind of like holy type place and sacred ground, kind of up in the clouded mountains and, ponds on top of mountaintops type things. And then you also get, a vast ocean and islands out on that ocean. And then, much later on, the entrance to Enkonoimia was introduced to us with the chasm, was introduced to us, which was just a whole nother type of zone. But that wasn't until after Inazuma, I think,
Yeah, it
right?
was pre
Yeah.
Sumeru posted.
So it was pre-Sumeru, but after Inazuma. So it took us a while to get there in Leo, and it was walled off for a period of time. But I will say some of my favorite things with Liyue, that stood out to me was when you're helping build the Jade Chamber, the big floating Jade Chamber where Ningguang is, and she wants to like make that happen again. And you have that massive fight, and the cutscene that went with that, I think was great. It just made it seem extremely epic and such a grand scale of an enemy, and really makes you wonder, man, why isn't the Traveler that strong when I play them? But it was still really, really awesome to experience kind of that type of cutscene. And there was a moment like that in Mondstadt, not as grand as this, but just to like say, hey, here's my moment of the zone. If I go back to Mondstadt real quick, to me, it's like when you're first introduced to Dvalin and he's flying over and it's just this huge dragon, and I wasn't really expecting that. I went in kind of blind, right? So that's my moment in Mondstadt. It's like that first introduction to Dvalin, and you're like, oh, okay, like he's huge. And then this grand fight at the Jade Chamber, floating up in the sky, and you got, I think it was the Leviathan or whatever coming out of the water.
Yeah.
And you have Ning Wong fighting it. You have, I think, Ganyu Shen, like all these folks. And admittedly, like some of my favorite character designs come out of Liyue, so that might also be why this is maybe one of my more favorite zones. But it also introduced to us a couple of weekly bosses, right? We have Child, who was that's the weekly boss I abused for the battle pass
Mm.
every time. Like it was just quick and easy. Don't collect the rewards. Boom, like easy done. But then it also had Azdaha, who I think was the first weekly boss that you couldn't really quote unquote one shot because he had forced immunity stage, which
Mm.
I really didn't like when they started introducing this on weekly bosses. Because the idea that you have a moment in the fight where your buffs are going, but you can't damage the boss. Um, so while I like the lore and the relationship and kind of how Zhongli presents things to you, I didn't like the fight itself. Um, and then my other, like I said, the other thing is I really like Zhongli as a character. Him being this strong deity and then kind of wanting to give that all up to live life is just like a normal citizen within the area. And his voice actor does a great job. So whenever he's pontificating about something, it's very stoic and it's very, well done. But that's kind of Leoa to me. What about for you, Steve? What stood out for you in Leoa, or maybe things that you didn't like?
Um, so I'm going to go over just a couple of things that you kind of touched on. Ajdaha is, I think, one of my least favorite bosses. Um, just as you mentioned, because of the forced invulnerability. Also, the fact that he wasn't the first story quest that he's not unlocked with the first story quest that you do for Zhongli. It's the second. And I had to, in order, his mat is what was needed for Kazuha. And I had to go through both of those story quests before I could unlock it. And I was on a very new account. So it was rough. Let's just put it that way. It was a very rough, especially also because I didn't have a shielder the
Mm.
first time I fought him for at least 2-3 weeks slash maybe months.
Oh,
I didn't
that
have a
fight is
shielder at
brutal. As
all.
a Zhongli abuser, yeah, that fight's like easy. It's just annoying, but yeah, without any shields and all the knockdown stuff, oof.
Yeah, the first time I beat him, I got the achievement of, oh, you didn't use a shield, and it's well, what did you expect? I didn't have anything that could shield. That's not like, there's no, other than Noelle, there wasn't a character that I had that could do it, and my Noelle was very underleveled by that point. Regardless, I got it done, beat him. I will also say that Liwa is the first region that starts using the traveler's ability to switch elements in puzzles and makes it to
Hmm.
where if you don't have Zhongli, the only way you can complete some puzzles is by using Geo Traveler to set off the weight pads and so on and so forth. Um,
That's right.
that's a design decision that they moved away from going forward. I'm not gonna say that's 100%, but for the most part, I don't remember Inazuma being quite as bad about this. Sumeru has other issues that we'll get to when we get to Sumeru.
As and what you mean, just to clarify, as far as forcing you to use the traveler's other sort of elements, because in
Yes,
so
yeah,
the default is Animo, Wind for those that forgot or unfamiliar, and then yeah, Geo for Leo. So basically, every zone has an element associated with it, and Shocker, the traveler, gets access to that element upon completion of story quests. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
no, you're good. That's a good point to bring up. So yeah, being forced to use that character unless you happened to have the Archon. I think those are basically the only two characters that can set that off. Maybe there are other geo constructs that will work for it.
Yeah,
I don't.
I think it's just those two, like
Yeah,
you said. The only one of the ones that did, I think, constructs were technically albedoed as constructs, but that didn't work for the puzzle for the pressure plates that you had to push down.
yeah. So it was just those two. And again, that's something that has gone away with time. It was certainly a design decision. I'm glad they shifted away from it. Um, I will also say that my strongest memory is grinding the G stasis for Liwa. Mainly,
Oh, the mini bosses.
yeah, the mini
Yeah.
boss, the daily boss that you can grind. Um, and that's mainly because I was really set later come Inazuma get oh, what is his name? Himbo guy. He's the Oni.
Oh yeah, yeah. Araki Ito.
Arataki Ito. Yeah. I was really set to get Ito until his model came out and was kind of disappointing for what I was hoping. And he didn't have a stand, which I was hoping that he would have. So I'd pre-grind for him before I'd fully seen everything. And then when he came out, I have a bunch of Geo stasises that I didn't need. But anyways, as far as the story and so forth goes, it was fine. I do like the characterization of Zhongli. I find the fact that he forgot to make his infinite amount of money before giving up his position as the guy who makes money. Um, it's a humorous little tidbit. I would say that Liwa has a tendency to show up a little bit too much to my liking.
Are
Mainly
you surprised though that a Chinese-based company focuses on the Chinese-based area of their game?
No, I'm not saying I'm surprised
Okay,
by it.
okay.
Just that, how should I put this? There's a lot of characters that are released for Liwa that if you didn't play during certain events, you have no idea who they are. You have no idea what they're about.
That's a fair point.
They basically existed for an event. That's when you got to know them, and then they disappear. And that's a problem with other characters as well. Not every character gets to be Ito, who's constantly in every event.
Every beetle battler, yeah,
Yeah, he's in everything. He's in everything. But it would be nice.
And maybe his voice actor's contract was very favorable, so they're like, let's get him in here.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and I get it. Ito is again, we're jumping a little bit ahead. Ito's a character that lends himself well to events because he's big, dumb, and stupid and can lead you into stories. But, I would say overall the idea of, Liwa kind of moving forward as a city separated from the Adepti, separated from their god, and kind of, becoming their own thing was interesting. It kind of ends up getting walked back as other future events occur, where you're just left kind of going like, well, but all the Adepti are still running around, and yeah, I know that Zhongli isn't stepping in, but the main character is an extra dimensional maybe god? I don't know, that's a little bit weird. Who's, constantly sticking their fingers into Liwa and helping out, so they're not really doing it for themselves. They're kind of just getting help from somebody else instead. But whatever. Again, Liwa is a fun zone. It's not my favorite though. We're coming up to some other zones that I prefer.
All right. So speaking of other zones, let's jump. So the next major region, right? Because there are technically some sub-regions associated with Liwa that have come later down the path, being the chasm, which we kind of mentioned a little bit, Enka no Emiya, which was ultimately the underground portion there, and then Shenyu Vale, I think, is technically classified as in Liwa, even though it came after Fontaine. But
I thought Inikomia was Inazuma, but whatever.
Oh, okay. It came after.
Yeah.
But speaking of Inazuma, that would be the next major region that we want to talk about. And Inazuma, I think, was interesting because they didn't introduce it all really at once, because Inazuma is a series of islands. And in Inazuma, you have, ironically, despite being islands surrounded by water, the element is electric. And so with that, you have your Inazuma Archon being Raiden Shogun, the god of eternity, and she's an electro user similar to the theme of the region. Steve, if you have anything you want to kind of add to the descriptors there of Inazuma, or did you just want to dive into kind of sharing your thoughts on the region?
I'll just really quickly note that it's the Japanese region. It's very heavily
I did not mention that. Sorry.
Built on Japan. It also has a very distinct purple coloring to the region. Like almost every island you go to will be in shades of dark blues, purples, some pinks, and so forth. But it's a very purple zone to again represent Electro. But that's really it. We can jump into the region itself, I guess, from there.
Yeah. So with the region itself, this was the first region that we were introduced to travel by boat. So right before they launched it, right, was our first summer event with the Golden Archipelago Islands, where they were like, here's these boats to traverse around. And that was more really, I think, of a tester to like, hey, how do players feel about this mechanic, and then really just like diving into it in Inazuma. Um, which was fine. I don't have any issues with the boat traversal, because it is something that they've continued to do on. But when they released Inazuma, it was, I think it's 4 or 5 islands, and they essentially gave us 2 big islands, and then the next patch, like they gave us 2 more islands, and then I think gave us then the last one,
Yeah, I think it's
for
5.
the culmination of the story. And something that they did here, and they kind of, I think they did this with other areas, but I think this was maybe the grandest scale they went to in terms of was story quests altering the environment
Mhm.
itself. So you would have like a bunch of puzzles that you would do that would ultimately like completely drain a lake or would clear up an electrical storm or whatever it was to allow you access to to essentially more puzzles and more chests and goodies, right? Um, so I thought that was an interesting. I like that concept of a mechanic because some of these things, while they're relatively obvious, they're not like you do have to explore a little bit to find some of these quests,
I,
which
I,
I think
I
is kind of cool.
I would put a caveat on that,
Sure.
because I feel
Okay.
like that works in the context of Inazuma was given to us in very bite-sized pieces, because we only got an island or two
Hmm.
each release, each patch. You were really able to deep dive in and really focus in on each individual island, on each on the quest there, and so on and so forth. I'm not as big of a fan of the quests change the overworld in the other zones, other regions, primarily because they are so large and kind of sprawling that it's difficult to hone in on them in the same way that you could with Inazuma. Because, again, you were kind of forced into a very small region. Everything was fairly self contained. There wasn't a lot of island hopping in quests. Everything was very regional, very localized.
That's a fair point to make. I can see where you're coming from on that, and I think, and you kind of touched on there at the very end. Everything was very like isolated to its own island, which is actually very pro because the storyline of Inazuma was like we're never changing, we're isolated. This we are who we are. Like we don't want to really interact with the outside world type stuff
Yeah,
because
they'd closed themselves off from.
yeah, they close themselves off from society. So, playing into this story, I found the story to be very interesting. I really liked Shogun as a character. I know she was when she was released on a banner, she was like one of the top selling banners they've ever had. People absolutely loved her. They thought she was beautiful. She also like her kit mechanics at the time were just like, oh my goodness, meta, gotta have it. As Steve's logic always goes, they don't make weak archons. Like when archons are released, they are going to be good, and she was no exception. But the storyline itself, the moments for me in this one, yeah, there were 2 moments for me. One was yeah, R.I.P. Senora, who she was one of the weekly bosses was Senora, and then ultimately yeah, Raiden Shogun also became a weekly boss as well. But yeah, the cutscene where those two are interacting, and then Raiden ultimately ends Senora. Spoiler alert: it's been 3 years. You've had enough time. Uh, yeah, that was a moment because at the time, and even the smallest of small parts of me holds out hope. We thought Senora was ultimately going to get a redemption and be a story playable character at some point, but not so much anymore.
We believe, but, eh.
Right. There's a small, tiny little bit of me, hope of hopes. But and then the other cutscene that I remember that kind of stood out was your boy Kazuha
Mhm.
and all of the illusion or all of the not delusions, but illusions,
Visions.
visions. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, all the visions and like that cutscene where he's charging up with them and kind of full force. Those were kind of 2 moments that stood out to me uh when exploring and adventuring in Inazuma. What about
Yeah.
you, Steve?
Definitely Kazuha using his friend's electro vision, which
Yeah.
Again, for those of you who don't play Genshin, every character except for the main character, the traveler, can only ever use one vision of one element. And Kazuha is Anemo. He's wind, but he had a friend who was Electro, who died, and he collected his vision, and he was trying to find somebody else who could use it in order to carry on his friend's will. And again, for context, Raiden is also known for her swordsmanship, which is why everyone was very confused when she was a polearm character.
Yeah, that's right. I totally forgot that whole fiasco.
She's explicitly known for her ability to use a sword and have a like single one-hit kill sword strike that like you cannot block, you cannot dodge. It just kills you. She used it to kill a giant serpent at one point in the story, in the past. But she's known for this. Kazuha's friend was like, you know what? I'm going to tank that. I want to see that. I want to fight that one ultimate kill move. And of course, he gets bodied. Kazuha gets his friend's vision. Story moves forward. Raiden is going to use that skill on, I believe, the Traveler. Was the context of it. She's going to use it, and Kazuha basically activates his friend's vision, which should be impossible, in order to basically flash step and block the sword strike, and survive it. Like he basically manages to parry it enough for him and the Traveler to survive. And it's a very cool scene, very emotional. Again, it's one of my favorites.
Me want to go back and build and figure out my Raiden team again.
And I think my other big story moment that I love is the fact that Kokomi is a lizard person. That is my other favorite story beat.
What, you gonna elaborate on that one for anybody who's like,
feel like I shouldn't. I feel like I should just let that lay there. But
okay.
You know what? No, I'm gonna leave it there. Kokomi is a lizard person. If you want to know why, you have to play through Inakomiya. I will say also that since we've covered the positives, one of the negatives I would say of Inozuma's story is that it's built around this concept of a war going on, a civil war and conflict within the setting, but it doesn't really live up to that scale. The big war that happens is a single cutscene with like 50 dudes.
Yeah.
So that is a bit of a negative of it. The limitations of the system and so on kind of didn't let them tell that story the way that they
wasn't as grand of a scale in the war scene as you were wanting, where everybody's charging at each other. Not the same effect.
Yeah, and even then, like outside of it, they don't do a great job of making you feel the war. Like you get that one cutscene, and that's sort of it. That's all you get for the actual war itself, and the rest is spent kind of running around doing logistics, which I get logistics are important in a war, but doesn't quite hit the same way as going out and like having to fight a bunch of people on the front lines and save people and so on and so forth. It was very hands off in that sense.
And then we also had in Inazuma, we had another collectible introduced to us with I believe it was the Sakura blooms.
So the Sakura
those for the Sakura tree.
Oh, for the tree, those were the seals.
Yes.
So.
So we had to get those. So it kind of brought back that gimmick that was introduced in Dragon Spine. And they brought it back here in Inazuma for us to go give those to the tree, the Sakura tree. So again, not a terribly bad mechanic. And like you'd mentioned also earlier too, there were new puzzle mechanics introduced based around electricity, but the Traveler specific electro abilities were not necessary. It was doable with other electro users. Now, as far as to the level of frustration with some of those mechanics, the puzzle mechanic that drove me nuts was the one where you had to get the arrows pointed in certain directions, and you move them by being near them while you're electrode charged. But if you're within an unseen radius that you were just guessing at, you may move one that you've already put in place and you wanted to stay still. And those were extremely frustrating. Those were kind of frustrating to me. Like I think I didn't do a lot of them because of that frustration. Like I did some of like the really easy ones, but if I couldn't do it in like 30 seconds to a minute, I'm like, all right, I'm out. I'm on to this next chest that I gotta go. Because that's how I explore. It's like I go, oh, a chest, let's go to that. Oh, a puzzle, let's go to that. Oh, a chest, let's go to that. But when I saw those and if it was not cooperating in the direction I wanted it to go in, or it was picking up that I was electrocharged when I'd already set that one in place, I was like, all right, I'll just go to the next one.
Yeah. For the most part, I was okay with the puzzles. I will say my biggest complaint was the fact that for the Sakura Bloom collectible item that you needed in order to level up characters and so on and so forth, the regional item that you needed,
Mm-hmm.
there was the Sakura Bloom specifically. You could only collect them after you hit them with Electro, which was very annoying because I had Ayaka who uses them, and she's on a Frost team. So if you had Ayaka and you wanted to like play with her and level her up and so forth, you had to randomly put onto your Freeze team, which is normally Cryo and Hydro. You had to throw on an Electro character in order to make sure that you could actually ding and collect. It felt very off in that sense. Also, it just made collecting them a pain in the butt because you had to have a very specific character type to run around and
Yeah,
collect
that is
them.
not kind of a sore spot for me. Is I was running the Raiden team with her and Eula, so I do not have that heartburn like you do. But yeah, that would be annoying to sort out one specific character.
Well, and again, this was I started just before Inazuma came out, so I didn't have a lot of Electro characters. I basically had Fischl and I had Lisa, and that
Mm-hmm.
was it. So trying to collect them was a bit of a frustration. I would say that it is important to bring up this also was the introduction of the sort of zipline mechanic where you could quick travel and
Yes.
zip all over the place, which comes up quite a bit in the future.
Yeah, so like floating in the air, and when you were electrocharged and you were near, you hit T, then yeah, you zoom to the thing, and then T to go to the next thing, and so on. So if you're playing on PC, if you're playing on mobile,
Yeah.
more power to you. Kudos. That's not something I would not want to play Genshin on the phone.
Yeah. And I guess unless you have anything else to cover, I just have one last thing I'd like to talk about before moving on.
Yeah, go for it. Yes, sir.
So sort of the last point that I'd like to talk about with is that Inazuma really seemed to focus on energy recharge in a lot of its characters and a lot of its gameplay. Like its meta was built around energy recharge,
Good point.
which was
Yeah,
sort
they
of
did
which was sort of the first big change because this was patch 2.0, like or 2.x. It was the second year. This was the big meta shakeup that came with Zuma was, hey, energy recharge is going to start mattering now. We're not going to be giving out a ton of 40 cost, 50 cost, 60 cost ults, characters with ults that cost that much. You're going to start seeing 200, 160. The energy cost of ultimates really started to balloon around this point to help encourage building energy cost. Gun I was built around energy recharge. She really hyper boosted that. So that was sort of the meta of that time, which then led into Sumo. And I'll let you kick it off, Dave.
Yeah, so looking at Sumeru, we have was the Dendro region. So right, so with the new region, a new element for the traveler being that Dendro path. We get the Sumeru Archon Nahida, who was the god of wisdom, or Lesser Lord Kusanali. And Sumeru is interesting because we've talked about regions and their sub-regions. And so we have Sumeru, which very Dendro, like it's very foresty, grass everywhere. But then also a big portion of Sumeru and a larger landmass than Sumeru is a giant desert, which is barren and was super boring to run across. And while the Sumeru story was interesting with the dreams and what people were experiencing and the citizens and the control that the academy was, instilling, or the corrupted powers that be, I should say, or instilling, was all well and good. But this was the first zone, I think, that I just actively hated most of the new puzzle mechanics. Like I would say this was the first zone that a majority of the new puzzle mechanics I did not enjoy. Specifically when it comes to the desert. We had things in the desert like the invisible walls, and then the exploring of the ruins, but you couldn't explore the ruins unless some piece that you got was of a certain level. But to even get it to that level, you had to do some random side quest
Yep.
that you may or may not have unlocked. And 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 you may be listening to this and thinking, well, Dave, earlier you said you liked plot quests that changed the appearance of the world. I would categorize this differently because this isn't changing the appearance of the world. This is literally a random item that you get as a quest word or whatever in your inventory. It's not changing the world in any form or fashion, and it's not being directly told for you how to get it. It quite literally is missable if you're not like you can never find it potentially,
Yeah,
and just be
and
like, well, how do I do this? I don't know.
yeah, I think a caveat for that is a lot of the big changes
Caveats.
that
All right.
happened in Inazuma were you would do the island's main story, and that would sort of make those changes. It was very much so the core of what you were doing on the island that made the change. Whereas in Sumeru, especially the desert region, these were minor subquests. Like there's a couple big ones that make some big changes. Like I would argue the main Crimson King, I think that's the name of the character, Scarlet King, um, quest where you go in and you do adventure, like that portion of it worked for me. But there's a lot of it where it's a no, you have to do this minor sub quest or you have to go to this specific
Yeah.
location and pick something up,
Yeah,
as David.
if it's essentially forced on you through a main quest or a very obvious side quest, but it's one of those main side quests that has the blue thing that pops up on your screen, like quest started. That's going to be a bigger quest and do something. I'm fine with that. If it's a sub quest that's so minor that all it is a blue exclamation mark when you're nearby it in order to see it to pick it up, like I think that's basically how like the genie stuff, like to find the genie stuff.
I mean,
That's how you get the genie bottle. It's like you randomly find an exclamation mark, and I'm like, well, I'm glad I looked into this because I wouldn't have known. Because I came to something in the overworld that's like, how do I interact with this? And then I looked it up, and I was like, oh, well, where's that quest? Oh, well, I have to do this quest. Oh, well, I have to do that quest. Oh, it's part of this giant chain. And yeah, so some of those mechanics just didn't really enjoy. But again, even some of the puzzles themselves with like the invisible walls or the invisible floors that you're running across, and you have to get to a certain point in a certain amount of time, but you could potentially fall off those floors or not, get through the walls right. That was a little obnoxious. And then there's another mechanic that I found kind of a little frustrating. I got a better grasp on it as time went on, where like when the stones had patterns on them and you had to find where the answer to the riddle was or get them in the right order, and they were usually somewhere else on a wall or hidden.
yeah.
It wasn't always the most obvious, or they weren't necessarily the most nearby, or it was confusing which puzzle answer corresponded to which stone. And then also the mechanic that kind of was like for me would be the pet item that you get where you're the pink floaty flowery guy, and you can go up and interact with different stimulus in the world to either move the zip line things that we referred to that were introduced in Inazuma, or to absorb some power and break something, or make a wall disappear type
Yeah.
thing. I think is the best way I can phrase that without actually looking up what the real terminology was in game knowledge. Yeah, so those are the kind of things that unfortunately had a negative output for me on that one. But as far as kind of some more memorable moments, so Sumeru introduced us to a couple world bosses, right? So we have the Wanderer as one of the world bosses in there, which I just remember that being a massive like scope of that battle, in that there was literally a phase in the fight where you jump into like a compartment in his chest and you're just shooting at the chest type thing. Like you're not even using your own abilities to get to that point. You're using some like fight mechanic that's not even used. So they really, I think that was like maybe one of the first fights they took and just made try and be this grander thing than you're using your own character and team synergies, and you're using these elements, not actual elements, but like not element like element interaction, I should say, but different fighting elements of a fight or mechanics of a fight that are outside of the player's character ability, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about you, Steve? I think I rambled and ranted long enough on my opinion and shortcoming. What about you? What do you think about Sumeru? What were your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you covered kind of all of our different topics, so I guess I'll jump through.
Yeah, where do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll jump through a couple of them.
Rambled.
Because it's top of mind, I'll go over the environmental mechanics. I would say for the most part, there were a number of mechanics that I did like. I liked clearing the corrupted zones that were
that was fun. That
existed. I think that was a neat little overworld mini event that worked well. I was not a fan of the not ocarina that you would use in order to do things for the Anaraja, I think is or what they were called. The little plant people quest.
Yeah, going into their world. Yeah,
going into their world or using it to teleport or do certain events. Like it was fine, but I didn't really love it. I'll be honest. Sumeru was kind of the first miss for me from a environmental design point of view. Story-wise, it was 10 out of 10. The Endless 8 section was amazing, where you were looping through time. The ending of it manages to be emotional and not overly saccharine. Like it hit well with me. I don't know if maybe somebody who's playing just all the way through it would feel the same way as somebody who had to kind of play it doled out over multiple patches, but the main Sumeru story really worked for me quite a bit. I do think that it is important that we also bring up the fact that Sumeru brought in Dendro, which was the first and only new element that has been added to the element system of of Genshin Impact. And I cannot overstate how much of a breath of fresh air that was for the game. The biggest downside to that was that there were no Dendro characters for the first couple patches, so trying to actually use the element was a bit of a pain in the butt, which is why I kind of hedged myself a little bit when mentioning that you didn't need the Traveler for certain overworld puzzles, because when Dendro first came out, or when Sumeru first came out, the only Dendro character that you had easy access to was the Traveler. There was an event that they had that would let you get Kole, but she was not one that you could get quickly. Like, I think you could get a copy of her within like a week or two. But by that point, you'd probably have already mainlined the story and had lots of exploration to get done. So the Traveler was really your only option for a decent chunk of time. And Dendro, of course, opened up Electro as a element and a team type. Hydro stonks just keep on going up. Hydro is really boosted by it. Really, the fact that Dendro doesn't interact with Pyro or Cryo in any meaningful way. I know that Pyro burns Dendro, but let's be blunt, it doesn't.
I think that's about to change in Natlan. But yeah, at time of release, yeah.
As of right now, as of pre-Natlan, the two don't interact in any meaningful way. If there is something out there that like Natlan is going to really just hypercharge the burning interaction, then great. But I'm curious to see if that's going to be the case. We
did just get Emily, but anyway, that's more in our character review of last week's episode. But yeah,
yeah. And again, I question whether Yai Miko was more of a hiccup or not in that regard of the last female character being prepped for the next zone. But anyways, regardless, yeah, there's that. I think really the biggest issue I have with Sumeru is that it's a region that is split in half, and I don't necessarily like the flavor of either the chocolate or the peanut butter that they're giving us. Like, I'm sure that it was meant to be two great tastes that taste great together, but in this case, it just didn't work for me. I think that the jungle region of Sumeru had too much verticality within it. Like, it was built with too much up and down, things above other things, with other things sort of in the middle, and it made navigating it an annoyance. Whereas the desert kind of had a similar problem of you have the top level that is very boring, and then you had a bunch of tunnels underground that were confusing to try and navigate, and then on top of the fact that you had to do quests in order to unlock sections, made it hard to impossible to try and complete things in those areas. Overall, I don't know, 4 out of 10 as far as like environmental design of the region.
Well, I'll say we got. I mean, we do have the 5 regions. We're about to talk about Fontaine, but we can ultimately rank them once we get through our quick review as far as least favorite to favorite. So we be thinking about that. There, it's a little surprise I've kind of thrown at and decided I think we can do. But moving into the last section, to talk about the most recent region we had was going to be Fontaine, which was our hydro element region, with our Fontaine Archon Farina, who's the god of justice, or Focalors, or Focalors? Was it Heartsea?
It's
or
Focalor. It's a Heartsea.
Focalors, or is it Focalors? Anyway, Farina. And so for me, this region was probably one of my favorites. I mean, I'm a little biased because water is probably my favorite element. Blue is my favorite color, so it had that going for it off the rip already. But I did enjoy a lot about this zone. And so I want to say that first, because the negative that I do have on the zone would be, which is a big detractor to me, and actually is kind of the reason I haven't done a major sub quest yet, is the terms of like underwater exploration / combat. The idea of underwater combat, and you're not using your character's abilities, you're using random abilities you're finding from the sea life, is a little irksome. I mean, logistically, I would understand why you can't use a fire ability underwater, right? So I get stuff like that. But for big areas that have creatures that you need to farm materials from, and they're predominantly or majority found underwater, really didn't enjoy that. And I pulled for a few characters during Fontaine's banners, because I pulled for Navi, I pulled for Clorinde, I pulled for Farina, and all of those characters have some type of underwater mechanic or underwater material that you need to farm, whether it be the pearls or the teardrops, which I don't mind so much because that's just going and getting them, and way easier to do than, say, the violet grass you would have to farm in lieu of like climbing those mountains. I'd rather swim than climb when it comes to farming materials that you just pick. But in terms of the materials you need through combat, like the sometimes from the mechanical fish, or if like from the crabs or the natural fish, those are kind of annoying too, because it takes longer to kill those things with some of the underwater abilities than I would with just like my normal skills, if they just let me do those. Or if I could find them on land, that was like my preferred, like, oh, I can find these crabs on this shoreline, I'll go fight them and knock them out like that. But as far as the region again as a whole, really enjoyed it. The puzzles and some of the mechanics and stuff, just kind of enjoyed. It didn't require too much craziness, like we just come from Sumeru, and I guess, and that could also be part of why I feel this way, is because it came after Sumeru, which I was so down on in terms of the puzzle mechanics. Like, even if these maybe aren't viewed as being great in others' eyes, because it was after Sumeru, I'm elevating it perhaps. So there's that biases maybe perhaps. But really enjoyed. For me, the standout moment in Fontaine would be in the story quest, when you're kind of getting the big reveal and you're learning about Farina and the split, and like the role she's been playing for whatever it was, 300 plus years, 500 plus years. And I really liked how they presented that, and really, I think, did a good job of making the player understand and feel exactly how much weight she is carrying on her shoulders, and how that weight affected and changed her over the course of time. Steve, how about?
I'm a lot more negative on Fontaine than I think you are. I don't know how much of that is just Genshin burnout, where, unfortunately it came out after the release of Honkai Star Rail, and I'm going to be honest, Honkai Star Rail has kind of become much more my main gacha game than Genshin has. So I've been a bit more negative on Fontaine. I do agree. Um, 8 out of 10, too much water, I believe is the meme. Might have the wrong IGN score, but yeah, just a little bit too much water in the zone. I get it, it's the hydro zone, but the fact that you have to use a completely different control scheme, an entirely different combat system for the majority of the zone is annoying. The story wasn't bad, but it didn't do quite as good a job of hooking me as Sumeru did. And I don't know how much of that is just that I think Farina really turned me off in her first introduction, and I understand where they were going with the character, why the character is the way that is. In hindsight, it kind of works, but I don't know. It didn't quite hook me the same way it did with you, Dave. I think the other part that kind of annoyed me was the underground prison section.
I didn't love that, but yeah.
Yeah, it was such a pain in the butt. It was such a side quest that you're locked into, and you have to jump through these hoops, and it was very frustrating. That really burned through a lot of my goodwill. I do agree that the ending, the capstone to it, really paid off. I like Farina much more as a character as a result of that ending, and it went a long way to redeem her. I also found the serial killer subplot that they introduced. I believe it was in the first in 1.0.
Yeah, first part when everybody was still cursed. I was about to say we just randomly have a serial killer in this super dark storyline that hasn't ever happened before.
Yeah, and especially the ending of it. Like I was actually very pleased with the ending of it, because I was expecting the anime style. Oh, we found out this person's sad backstory, therefore they are redeemed, and the story does not do that. They go, no. This guy's a serial killer. He gets his just desserts. And that made me kind of sit up and go, oh, I like that. That was a take that I'm 100% behind. Like I can
not expecting that ending.
Yeah.
At all for a game that has been very happy, colorful, bright, kind of kitty in terms of some of its messaging, and then you get this dark timeline, and it's like, dude does not get redeemed. Dude gets absolutely crushed, and it's fantastic.
Yeah. And especially because they had just spent a bunch of time building up how I don't want to say forgivable, but building in a lot of his reasoning, why he is the way he is, this traumatic and depressing and so forth backstory as to why he's doing what he's doing, and how he's motivated by love and so on and so forth. And then it sort of ends with no, you're even the person you were doing this all for is kind of like, you can go rot. Regardless, again, that's a solid story point. Unfortunately, that sagging middle of the prison really just did not work for me, and sapped a lot of my goodwill from the story. I have decent hopes for Natlan, but I'm going to be honest, Fontaine just was not my favorite as a zone. I would also say that I think part of it is that Fontaine really hasn't come with a big shakeup to the meta the same way that the release of Dendro was for Sumeru. The big sort of thing that Fontaine was about was HP draining. Kinda. It was there for 2 units, and then it sort of disappeared. Then they added Bond of Life, which is kind of that mechanic, but it explicitly blocks healing in the zone about Hydro, which is all about healing. I don't know. I usually like those type of characters. For those of you out there who play Magic the Gathering, I'm very much so a black-red player. So I'm willing to burn life in order to do damage and have effects and do cool stuff. But it just didn't quite seem to fit tonally within Hydro and within Fontaine. And again, there wasn't any real big shakeup. That was sort of just a general, okay, we're kind of doing this, but that's it. They weren't. There wasn't anything else to kind of add spice to the game. In the same way that Dendro, I felt really helped it out. But I
I will
realize they can't release a new element every.
I will say it was another thing that was kind of cool that stood out was Neuvillette in terms of like the story lore
Mhm.
was really cool. I thought when the like you, I agree the prison stuff did kind of drag on, but when we ultimately got to the climax of that story arc and the water busting through and Neuvillette going down and being a badass, I did think that was pretty cool. And then like kind of learning his backstory and lore a little bit,
Mhm.
um, and then yeah, of course, then the final ultimate cutscene with the water rising, and then yeah, people not turning into water right first, quote unquote, being lifted. Um,
Yeah, and
and a redeemable moment, like you said, for Rena, so you learn more about her. I agree with that completely.
yeah, that and it opens up an interesting new story path with the fact that all of the dragons that we've seen previously have been, subservient to the Archons, and they're weekly bosses. Like every other dragon is a weekly boss. And with Neuvillette,
Character.
he's character, yeah. And it opens up an interesting path that I could see the story going down about, like, okay, the Archons are losing their gnosis, they're losing their godhood. That's basically been what's happened in every single region up to this point. I strongly suspect that when we get to Natlan, the Fire Archon is not going to be the Fire Archon by the time we finish that story.
And just and very quickly, speaking of Natlan, to kind of like talk about it very briefly, and then we can go into our ranking of the 5 regions. So with Natlan, that is going to be kind of that upcoming patch. We're going to talk more about that in depth next week. But just kind of brief tidbit about it. It's going to be a pyro element theme. The Archon you mentioned, Murata, is going to be the god of war. We were, I think, introduced to her in the trailer that was released, I think, about a week ago or so.
Seems to be sports. I know that they're talking about war, but there seems to be a very heavy sports theme with it as
I
well.
mean, gladiator battles was sports, but yeah, maybe.
There's also a lot of like ball. When I say like
Yes.
ball, I mean like football, soccer ball, handball. Like there's a lot of that sort of theming. Like just looking at the characters. But again, that's maybe more for next week's theory crafting.
Yeah. We'll dive into our thoughts on that and stuff on next week. But I did want to get into our rankings very quickly. So kind of, since I spurred this on you, right, and kind of in the spur of the moment calling an audible, I'll go ahead and rank mine first, and that way you can kind of have time to collect your thoughts and think about it.
Okay.
So for me, starting with my least favorite, and then ultimately going to my favorite. Least favorite is going to be Sumeru. Um, Again, I harped on a lot of the negatives in terms of puzzles and some of the new mechanics they introduced that I didn't love. The positives for it, yes, it did introduce Dendro. It had the storyline was good, and Nahida is a great Dendro character, Archon that was introduced to us as well. But for me, again, exploration, a lot of the puzzle mechanics they introduced just missed with me. So that would be my number 5. For me, number 4, gonna be Mondstadt. It's not because I view it necessarily as being bad per se. Uh, Again, it was a good intro to the game, but because it is the intro, the ceiling, can only be so high on what you can do with the prologue to the game effectively, right? So it did its job. It wasn't bad by any metric, but it is going to be number 4 for me, being the prologue of the game and capped by its necessary place in the story and introduction of the game. Number 3 is going to be Fontaine for me. Again, I enjoyed a lot of the story, not necessarily the prison part, but I enjoyed the storyline. Some of them got, like you said, pretty dark, with some not anime, happy-go-lucky ending, right? But some real like, oh look, it's the actions, it's the consequences of your actions. Wow, okay, awesome, glad they did that. Um, the thing that kind of maybe kept this down for me then from being higher is yeah, that water combat, water exploration stuff. Um, not great. Some of those puzzles that are underwater, like just like blow up all the little orange balls, and you only have 2 bursts to do it in. Yeah, that not great for me. But again, the over on land stuff, good, fine. A lot of those puzzles were good and interesting. Uh, Number 2 for me is gonna be Inazuma. I really enjoyed Inazuma, how it was introduced, portrayed to us island by island, so it didn't feel like it was overwhelming you with all the stuff to explore. And it's a lot easier to track what you've done on an island than a sprawling landmass or desert, like Izumuru. Um, and again, Inazuma was, I think, a great storyline, introduced us to some fantastic characters with Raiden Shogun, with Kazuha, uh, and Kokomi, and again, just I think really, really well done in that region. And then my favorite region gonna be Liyue. Again, I think part of this is because they've done so much in Liyue. It has a lot of like good, fond memories. A lot of great characters from Liyue that I enjoy and still use in my party. So like Yelan, Zhongli, or characters that I built parties around. So somebody like Ganyu, Shenhe, even Ning Wang of a 4-star unit. I think she was the first 4-star character that I actively built a team around back when that was going on. It was her, my Geo mommy, and then Zhongli, my Geo daddy. Built the team around those two. And then Liyue itself just being so grand and having a lot of things going on with it. But that would be my rank. Steve, how about you?
So
Or do I need to stall more?
no problem. So for me, bottom of the pile would probably be Fontaine. Two really good story beats aren't enough to kind of carry the region for me. Followed up right behind it with Sumeru. I think the story for Sumeru was amazing, but everything else about that zone. Once you're done with the story quest, the main Archon quest of Sumeru, get out. Like there is nothing else there that I really care too much about. There were some neat stories in the desert, but nothing that I wouldn't be willing to just toss. Then third would be Liyue. I'm very neutral on it. It's a fine zone. It's good enough, but really the definition of mid for me. Again, the story also wasn't one that I particularly loved. I didn't hate it, but didn't really love it. Mondstadt would be second. I enjoy all the characters from Mondstadt. It's the home of Klee, so that automatically gives it a bump up. And it's in my mind classic Genshin. I think that if you were to ask anyone what is Genshin Impact, Mondstadt is what would come to mind for them. And then finally, number one would be Inazuma for all the reasons I've mentioned. It did exploration great. The story was solid, had a lot of great characters in that. Wasn't without weakness. None of these zones or regions are perfect, but Inazuma was the one that I think hit the best with me. I will also be honest, I really liked the color palette that they used. The blues, the purples, the pinks, and so on and so forth really brought it a unique look to the rest of the Genshin world. Oh yeah.
Well, there we have it for our region review. Now, moving to our next topics, we do have a new event going on that we want to talk about, and we also have a good bit of news outside of the Hoyoverse world. So I want to shift over and let's talk about that event next. So looking at the events this week, Genshin, we have the new event Energy Amplifier Lemma. And for that, Steve, let me throw it over to you. What's going on with the event?
So it's a Genshin event. It is a fairly bog standard combat event. You choose upgrades to the fight that you want to have. Do you want to do more damage with pyro, cryo, whatever? Along those lines, and you fight and you're good. It's a pretty bog standard one. Should have about 3 days, I believe, 4 days to finish it up by the time this goes live, maybe a little bit more. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty quiet when it comes to events in the Hoyoverse games this week. Also quiet on a release front. We don't talk about ZZZ characters, so really nothing to say in regards to Genshin or Star Rail. And I guess with that said, let's kick it over to other gotcha events.
Yeah, so yeah, pretty quiet on the Hoyo versus front with the gearing up for Natlan. I know we're all excited for that, and we'll be having a plethora of information once that goes up. But yeah, outside of Hoyoverse, we actually have a good bit of stuff going on that I wanted to touch on. So a couple games we mentioned in the past, and some that we play, and even maybe some that we don't. Um, First and foremost, wanted to talk about the Azure Lane is celebrating their 6th anniversary here on the global server. So that kicked off this past week. So with that, they've introduced some new ship girls. Of course, there's new skins, new events, new story event if you play that game for the story. They also gave away, as a kind of a thank you to players, 700 diamonds, which is the primo currency that you basically use to buy the skins or increase dock space or whatever have you. It's not whole currency because you get enough of that as it is. So I thought that was might be a time if you're checked out and you're like, man, I only go to check stuff like that. Might as well log in, get those 700 diamonds. They also are giving a promise ring as well, which is how you oath your ship foos, which gives them a couple of increased stats. And some of them have some unique oath skins if you're interested in that type of stuff. So we have that going on. Other news, we had, I think, mentioned it a couple episodes ago, but the gacha game Cat Fantasy is coming out on August 21st, which is going to be Wednesday. So this is going to be, looks like a card battler type game where your characters are waifus who are cats. Not cat girls, they are literally cats that transform into waifus. So I'll probably at least be trying it out. It was very popular overseas. I wonder why. But I'll at least try it out, see how the gameplay loop is, and how those launch rewards go. Let you guys go maybe do a quick review. I think, Steve, you had mentioned it created an invisible line you didn't know you had, so you may not be trying that out. But
Yeah, probably not gonna touch it, or if I do, it's only be with the deepest of ironies.
hey, fair enough. Other news as well that week. So August 21st is Cat Fantasy. August 22nd, Nikke, Goddess of Victory, and Evangelion are having their collab event start. So the trailer for that just released here within the past couple days, or by the time we get this edited and put it up, it will have been a few days ago. So Nikke Evangelion, if you are playing Nikke, Goddess of Victory, just know that that's on the horizon. Or if you are a fan of Evangelion and were interested in trying out Nikke, might be a good time to start getting those login bonuses and such. No Break just released their trailer for their next version called Operation Midnight. So that's going to be coming out probably this next week as well, because I think the current event ends in 6 days. So again, by the time this goes live, it's probably about 3 days. So I think this may go out that next week as well. And then for another game, we have Reverse 1999. They also released their next version 1.8 trailer called Farewell Rayashi. And I'm probably mispronouncing that. That was a Reverse 1999 was a game I think we both tried out. Definitely had some production value. Just it was a vibe. Didn't necessarily click with me, Steve. I don't think it clicked with you either, right? Or are you still playing that?
No, didn't really click with me. Again, great vibe, really neat. Just, I'm gonna be honest, felt a little bit impenetrable to me. So.
And then finally, in other news, we have Brown Dust 2. They just launched their part 2 of their summer event. So currently going on now for the next 3 weeks, or 2.5 weeks, I should say, by the time, again, this is up. We have a new Therese swimsuit skin. It is going to be a limited banner for her. So this one, what that means is it runs, and then once it's over, it's done. You'll not get her in the standard pull, or if you're pulling on a banner in the future, unless it's her specific banner, which typically they don't run those except for maybe a few months down the road, right? So if you do want to check in with the Therese limited skin, you will want to go ahead and pull, because again, she is limited. Her mechanic actually helps characters that are single hit And I think I've maybe talked about this in the past. The idea in the game to build more damage is to build up multiple strikes on a unit or a chain bonus damage. And then for Therese, she actually gives a big buff to units who don't have a lot of chain hits on them. So I think the chain is like, if it's under 5, it will do some bonus damage. But that's what's running currently. And then there are 3 other skins that are going to be coming out as part of this summer event, which will be running for the next couple of weeks. And these next 3 skins are not going to be limited, which means they will be available in other standard banner polls or other banners that they're maybe not featured on. But you're going to be seeing swimsuit skins for Eclipse, who already has I think about 2 skins out currently, but this is going to be a 3rd skin or skill in that game, right? We also are going to see the introduction of 2 new characters. So this is going to be their first skins in Michaela and Morpia. Not 100% sure on the pronunciations. They are characters, if you played Brave 9 or the original Brown Dust, right? These are going to be characters that you recognize, but they are going to be brand new to Brown Dust 2. So we should be getting, I believe Morpia will be next week. And then Eclipse and Michaela will be then after that one. So just something to keep an eye out if you are playing those games. They're very generous on the poll currency, so always a good time to start. If you're looking for a gacha that's slightly different in terms of the gameplay loop, and if you don't mind, or maybe you enjoy some pretty sophisticated art, we'll say, for men of
refined taste.
Thank you. That's where I was going with that sentence. Thank you. But that's going to do it for our news there outside of the Hoyoverse realm. We do want to thank you guys for joining us this week. Let us know what your favorite moments from Genshin's regions are, or maybe you have some thoughts about regions and mechanics that you didn't necessarily enjoy. I did also want to go ahead and say a special thank you to everybody in our community that's helping us grow. We did have a recent episode reach over 200 views, which was pretty cool for us. It hit 100 views and then it even catapulted up beyond that for us. So we do want to thank you guys for getting the word out, sharing it with friends, family, and whatever have you. So thank you guys for helping us out there. If you did enjoy the episode and you like this kind of content and want to support us, be sure to leave a like, follow, subscribe to the channel. Email us at brohoyopod@gmail.com with questions or suggestions for the show. We also have that link in the Discord in the description, so you can be sure to join us over there for news, game nights, content notifications. Join us next week when we go ahead and preview version 5.0 Genshin Impact, and we see what Natlan has in store for us, and also make some, dare I say, bold predictions. But until then, keep gaming.
We made a choice, go fight against your fate.